I am in Asheville, North Carolina today to visit the hometown of an American writer, Thomas Wolfe, that many consider brilliant and prolific, and who was both praised and criticized. But that is probably true of most writers who have been exposed to audiences on a national and international level. So much of his writings were influenced by Asheville and its people, as well as family and friends, that he became known as an autobiographical novelist. His life was short, but his writings certainly were not, as his 4 novels were uncommonly long. For instance, his first book, Look Homeward Angel, has 240,000 words, and that was after it was edited. The original manuscript had 330,000 words, which made it almost as long as Tolstoy's War and Peace. So let's take a look at this incredible talent and in many ways tormented literary giant. Thomas Wolfe was born on October 3, 1900, in Asheville, North Carolina. He was the youngest of 8 children born to William Oliver and Julia Elizabeth Wolfe. His mother's maiden name was Westall. Of the 8 children, 6 lived to adulthood. Asheville, North Carolina, in the year 1900, when Thomas Wolfe was born, had a population of 14,694, and because of its location in the Blue Ridge Mountains, was already becoming a tourist destination. People would come to enjoy the mountains, clean air, and to hopefully find relief from respiratory ailments such as tuberculosis. In the year 1900 in Asheville, the primary modes of transportation would have been horses, horse-drawn carriages, and wagons, railroad, and walking. Cars were very rare. The primary businesses of this time were textiles, tobacco, logging and lumber, tourism, transportation, retail, and banking. So, it was against this backdrop that Thomas Wolfe began his journey to literary history. But before I go any further with his story, I would like to give a brief background on his parents, as they, like all of his family, played a huge role in his life and writing. Wolfe's father came to Asheville from Adams County, Pennsylvania. William Oliver Wolfe was born on April 10, 1851. His gravestone says that he was born in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, but I have read that his actual place of birth was Lattimore Township, which is 20 miles or so from Gettysburg. He was one of 9 children. As he grew older, he went by the name W.O. W.O. became a stone cutter's apprentice at the age of 15 at a stone cutting shop in Baltimore, Maryland. It was in Baltimore that he became acquainted with the plays of William Shakespeare, and over time could recite passages at will. In 1869, W.O. took a job in Columbia, South Carolina, the state capital, to help repair the damage done to the Capitol building during the Civil War. Sometime in 1870, he moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, to help with building the state prison. It was during his time in Raleigh that W.O. entered into a stone cutting business with a gentleman by the name of John Caton. It was also during his time in Raleigh that W.O. added the letter E to his last name, as he thought it looked more distinguished. W.O. married Hattie Watson on October 9, 1873, in Raleigh, North Carolina, in what would be his first of 3 marriages. They separated some 15 months later, and the divorce became final in 1876. His second marriage occurred on March 25, 1879, to Cynthia Hill. She was 2 years older than W.O. Soon after, they moved to Asheville, North Carolina. Cynthia had tuberculosis, and they hoped the climate in Asheville would help. Cynthia died from tuberculosis on February 22, 1884. Thomas Wolfe's mother, Julia Elizabeth Westall, was born on February 16, 1860, in Swannanoa, which is just east of Asheville. Julia was one of 11 children born to Thomas and Martha Westall. The family was poor, and this left a lasting impression on Julia. In spite of the poverty she experienced, Julia made the best of her situation. She was active in church and loved the church singings. She loved to quilt, attended community dances, learned to play the violin, and was an excellent marksman with the rifle. She attended school in Swannanoa for 4 years, and after that it would be 8 years before she would attend school again. She then attended the Asheville Female Seminary and Judson College in Hendersonville, North Carolina, for a combined total of 2 years. Even with her limited educational background, she became a school teacher. She also sold books to supplement her income. Selling books is how she first met W.O. Wolfe, her future husband. This happened on October 18, 1884. On this day, Julia was going about in Asheville selling books door to door and went into W.O.'s stone-cutting shop at 22 South Pack Square. It is said that W.O. fell in love with her instantly, and despite being recently widowed, he and Julia married 3 months after first meeting. It could be said that the stage was set for the marriage to be troublesome from the beginning. Julia had dated a man by the name of Mark Lance, but that relationship had ended. Even so, Julia told W.O. that she could never love another man like she had Lance. W.O. didn't care, and he took Julia as his third wife. Once married, they lived at 92 Woodfin Street, where W.O. and his second wife had lived. This house was also where all 8 of their children were born. Julia continued to work hard, and her goal was to raise the economic prospects for her and her family. Eventually, she became interested in real estate. She started by taking in boarders at the house at Woodfin Street in Asheville. During the time that W.O. and Julia were having children, and Julia becoming more involved with her real estate dealings, their relationship became strained. I'll mention that W.O. was by most accounts an alcoholic and abusive, especially when drunk. And that brings us to Thomas Wolfe. Thomas Clayton Wolfe was born on October 3, 1900. He was the youngest of 8 children born to W.O. and Julia Wolfe. As I mentioned earlier, he, like all of the other Wolfe children, was born at the Wolfe home that was located at 92 Woodfin Street. The house on Woodfin Street is no longer standing, but it was located here where the YMCA is now. I was told that the house stood in the area of the YMCA parking lot. Thomas Wolfe would live at 92 Woodfin Street for the first 6 years of his life. I would like to mention here, of the 8 Wolfe children, 2 died at a young age. Leslie, the firstborn, and she was born in October of 1885, died of infant cholera at 9 months old. A son, Grover Cleveland Wolfe, was born in October of 1892 and died of typhoid fever in 1904. Thomas Wolfe was described as being complacent and tranquil as a child, eager to learn and silently curious. Thomas had a remarkable memory, even as a child, and this trait would serve him well throughout his life. But he came to this attribute honestly, as both of his parents also had this characteristic. It was in April 1904 that Julia Wolfe rented a house in St. Louis, Missouri. The house was located at 5095 Fairmont Avenue. The St. Louis World's Fair took place from April 30th to December 1st, 1904, and she rented this house to visitors from Asheville who were going to the World's Fair. 5 of her children, Mabel, Fred, Ben, Grover, and Thomas, went to St. Louis with her. The reason for the St. Louis venture was, of course, to make money for the family, but also to get away from W.O. His drinking was getting increasingly worse, and with that came more violent blow-ups. Unfortunately, one of her sons, Grover, who I mentioned earlier, contracted typhoid fever while in St. Louis and died on November 16, 1904, at the age of 12. After Grover's death, Julia would focus her attention more and more on her youngest child, Thomas, in terms of protection and possessiveness. His relationship with his mother could be thought of as a little odd in that I have read he nursed until he was 3.5 years old and also slept with her on and off until the age of 9. It seems that Julia did not want her youngest child to grow up. By 1906, Asheville, North Carolina had become a tourist attraction, and Julia, hoping to use this to her advantage, purchased a boarding house. This house was located at 42 Spruce Street and was located just 2 blocks from their home on Woodfin Street. Julia purchased the house from Reverend T.M. Myers, who named it Old Kentucky Home to honor his home state. This boarding house, along with Wolfe's family and friends, as well as other characters in Asheville, North Carolina, would one day play a major role in some of his writings. When Julia bought the Old Kentucky Home, it had 18 rooms. Eventually, Julia added 11 more. After Julia purchased the house, she moved in and she brought Thomas, who was 6 years old at the time, with her. The other children remained at the home at 92 Woodfin Street with W.O. Even though the 2 locations were only 2 blocks from each other, I have read that Julia, for the most part, had little to do with the 92 Woodfin location after buying the Old Kentucky Home. Thomas, by all accounts, lived an abnormal life after moving to the boarding house. With literally no privacy and no bedroom to call his own, he felt like a nomad. At times he would sleep with his mother, and other times he would occupy another room with one or more of the boarders that would be staying at the house. At other times he would be sent back to W.O.'s house to stay. But also in 1906, Thomas was able to find a refuge of sorts at the Orange Street School. He had followed a friend of his to the school one day, and the teacher, Elizabeth Bernard, allowed him to stay even though he was not yet old enough to attend. Thomas would go to school there from 1906 to 1912. Thomas gained an appreciation for reading at an early age, and as a young boy would spend hours reading books at home or at the local library. It was in 1911 that John Muncie Roberts became the principal at the Orange Street School. Mr. Roberts and his wife Margaret were also planning to open a private school for boys, and in an effort to find the best candidates for this new school, Mr. Roberts held a writing competition to gauge how competent the students were. He let his wife, Margaret, read the papers, and after she read Thomas's entry, she told her husband, "This boy, Tom Wolfe, is a genius, and I want him for our school next year." Margaret Roberts became the first person to recognize the genius of Thomas Wolfe, and Wolfe would become the first student to enroll at the North State Fitting School started by John and Margaret Roberts. Also, Margaret Roberts would become a major influence on Thomas, as she encouraged him to read the classics of literature and supported his desire to write. Wolfe would later refer to Miss Roberts as the mother of my spirit. There is no doubt that Thomas enjoyed his 4 years at North State Fitting School. After his 4 years at North State were over, Thomas expressed his desire to continue his education at the University of Virginia or maybe Princeton. W.O. would have none of this and told Thomas he could go to the University of North Carolina or he could get a job and go to work. W.O. felt this was the best option, as he, W.O., had always wanted Thomas to be a lawyer and maybe step into politics. So Thomas accepted the offer and enrolled at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. When Thomas arrived at UNC on September 12, 1916, he was 3 weeks shy of 16 years old. Even though his father had made it painfully clear that he wanted Thomas to be a lawyer, Thomas instead chose to continue on his own path, and that was to pursue literary studies. His courses would include algebra, trigonometry, English, Latin, and Greek. It has been said that Thomas was particularly fond of the Greek courses, and this would become apparent in his later writings. While his freshman year in college required an adjustment, he came to enjoy his college years as he was able to shed the awkwardness of trying to fit in and became engrossed in college life and all that it offered. He was a member of the Dialectic Literary Society, a member of the Phi Kappa Phi fraternity, and in 1919 was inducted into the Golden Fleece Honor Society. Wolfe would also become editor of the college newspaper. He also began writing stories and poems, and some of these he would contribute to the newspaper. He was also an original member of the Carolina Playmakers. This was a course in playwriting, and it inspired him to write The Return of Buck Gavin, and this would become a stage production of the Carolina Playmakers. It was during his time at the University of North Carolina that his brother, Ben, passed away from influenza 1 week shy of his 26th birthday. This had a tremendous effect on Thomas, as it was Ben who looked after him as he grew up. Thomas would later say of Ben, "I think the Asheville I knew died for me when Ben died. I have never forgotten him, and I never shall. I think that his death affected me more than any other event in my life." After graduating from UNC in 1920, Thomas hoped to continue his studies at Harvard University in their graduate school program. At this time, his father, W.O., who was dying from cancer, and W.O. thought any further money spent on education would be money wasted, and would not pay for any graduate study. His mother did, however, agree to loan him the money under the condition that the money would be subtracted from his share of his father's estate. Thomas enrolled in Harvard in 1920. He studied playwriting under the instruction of George Pierce Baker. While at Harvard, his time was split between his master's studies and Baker's 47 workshop. His first play that he wrote while at Harvard was a one-act drama called The Mountains, and was performed at the workshop, and it was not well received. The play encompassed the life Thomas knew from growing up in Asheville, North Carolina. This was a preview of Wolfe's future works. Thomas was discouraged by the criticism of the play, but did not let it deter him. Thomas received his master's degree in June of 1922. His father, W.O., also passed away on June 20th, 1922, at the age of 71 from prostate cancer. Thomas would return to Harvard in September of 1922 to continue his study at the 47 workshop under George Pierce Baker. His play, Welcome to Our City, was performed by his fellow students in May of 1923, and by all accounts was well received. The play itself was much like his future novels, meaning it was very long at 4 hours. With this play, he described his ideas as literary photography. But the play was rejected by the Theater Guild to which it had been submitted. The Theater Guild was founded in 1918 in New York City, and its purpose was, and still is, to produce high-quality, non-commercial American and foreign plays. Once his time at Harvard and the 47 workshop was over, Wolfe, unable to sell any of his plays, ended up teaching English at Washington Square College in New York City in February of 1924. Washington Square was and is a part of New York University. He would do this on and off for about 7 years. After accepting the teaching position, he moved into a room at the Hotel Albert. At this point, Wolfe was 23 years old and was 6'6", and at times would weigh as much as 240 pounds. He had brown hair and brown eyes. As I said, he was having no success selling his plays, but it would not be long before he would focus his talent on another area of writing. Thanks to the teaching position, he was able to save some money, and in October of 1924, he went to Europe. This trip would be his first of 7 such trips he would take overseas. While in Europe, he took the opportunity to write. He promised himself that he would write 1,500 words per day, and by all accounts was able to do so. His original plan was to take a leave of absence for 2 months and return to Washington Square and his teaching duties, but he would not return until the fall of 1925. He extended his initial stay in Europe by 5 months and continued to write as well as take in as much of Europe as possible. Running low on money and knowing his mother, who had been helping to support him monetarily, would not continue to do so, he arranged to come back to New York and resume his teaching duties. It was on his return trip from Europe on the RMS Olympic that he met Eileen Bernstein. She was a distinguished stage and costume designer from New York City. Ms. Bernstein was married and 19 years older than Wolfe. They started an affair that would last for the next 5 years. Wolfe stated that Eileen was the great love of his life. She supported him in every way possible, including financially, and encouraged him to broaden his writing to include novels. Her husband was a very successful stockbroker and, from what I have read, knew about the affair but did not intervene. Once back in New York, Wolfe resumed teaching and moved into an apartment at 13 East 8th Street that Eileen was renting as a studio. It was during this time that Eileen convinced Wolfe to give up playwriting and instead concentrate on novels. Wolfe took her advice and began the journey that would bring him notoriety and a discovery of his true calling. Wolfe returned to Europe in June of 1926, where he would rendezvous with Eileen, who was already there. It was on this trip that Wolfe began to write a novel about his life that he originally titled The Building of a Wall. Wolfe wrote his ideas, notes, and manuscripts in longhand, using pencils and paper tablets and composition books. He felt that his hands were too large and cumbersome to use a typewriter. He would hire others to type out his manuscripts. At Eileen's insistence, he started using accounting ledgers to write on so he could keep his writings in order. Wolfe returned from Europe in December of 1926 and would continue to work on his novel. He did make another trip to Europe in 1927 and returned in July. At this point, he continued teaching at Washington Square and also moved to another apartment at 263 West 11th Street in New York City. Eileen shared the apartment with him. Thomas Wolfe completed the manuscript that he had now titled "Oh, Lost" on March 31st, 1928. Eileen tried, through connections, to have the manuscript placed in the right hands for a review, but for some time was unable to do so. Finally, she was able to have the manuscript presented to literary agent Madeline Boyd. After reading just a portion of the manuscript, Ms. Boyd reportedly said, "I have discovered a genius." At this point, Wolfe hired Ms. Boyd as his literary agent. Because the manuscript contained 294,000 words, she told him that most assuredly cuts would have to be made. It would be another 7 months before a publisher was found. After giving the manuscript to Ms. Boyd and before a publisher was found, Wolfe took another trip to Europe. On this trip, he spent some time in Germany. In Munich, he was involved in a fight during a Oktoberfest celebration. He was reportedly drunk during this incident. I have read that Wolfe, like his father, would at times have a bit too much to drink, and also like his father, he could be aggressive when drinking. But anyway, he did suffer a broken nose, among other facial injuries, during this altercation. During this same trip, while in Vienna, he received a letter from Maxwell Perkins, who was an editor with the publishing house of Scribner's in New York City. Perkins wanted Wolfe to return to New York so they could discuss Oh, Lost. Perkins is known for discovering and working with authors such as Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Marjorie Kennan Rawlings. Thomas Clayton Wolfe would soon be added to that list. They did meet on January the 2nd, 1929, at Perkins' office. Perkins did not commit Scribner's to a deal until he and Wolfe had worked out all the details and both were on the same page. They agreed that Wolfe should take a few days to consider the proposal. Wolfe accepted the offer from Perkins and by doing so agreed to make cuts to the original manuscript. The contract was signed on January the 9th, 1929. Wolfe received a $500 advance. Wolfe would receive 25 cents per copy for the first 2,000 copies sold and 37 cents for each copy sold after. The book would sell for $2.50 for each volume. During the next several weeks, he and Perkins worked on making cuts and revising the manuscript. Finally, they reduced the manuscript by approximately 90,000 words. Next, Wolfe was asked to change the title. Wolfe was receptive and considered several, such as The Search for the Lost Boy, Remembering Home, and The Buried Life, to name a few. Finally, he settled on Look Homeward Angel. The title was inspired by the John Milton poem Lycidas. The title also represents a part of Wolfe's life that ties back to his father. As mentioned earlier, W.O. Wolfe was a stonecutter by trade. His one deficiency, at least in his eyes, was his inability to carve an angel's face. Therefore, due to this reason, W.O. would place orders for angel statues from New York whenever someone requested a marble-carved angel. One of the angels he ordered from New York was used as a porch advertisement at his shop in Asheville, North Carolina. A young Thomas Wolfe would see this angel repeatedly, and this no doubt played a role when he changed the title of the book from O Lost to Look Homeward Angel. The angel that once stood on the porch of W.O.'s shop is now located at the Oakdale Cemetery in Hendersonville, North Carolina. It was sold in 1906. After a short trip to Asheville, Wolfe returned to New York. At this point, he was still teaching at Washington Square while waiting for the publication of Look Homeward Angel. Finally, on October 18, 1929, Look Homeward Angel was published. His hometown of Asheville was not amused. The novel was a thinly veiled autobiographical account of Wolfe's life and experiences of growing up in Asheville, North Carolina. He used fictional names for family, friends, and places, but all of Asheville was aware of the real individuals his characters represented. The book contains more than 200 characters, and this made for some interesting conversations among the citizens of Asheville. Some stories in the book are true, and of course, some are fiction. After all, it is a novel. But that mattered not to a great majority of the people who were represented by the fictional personalities in the book. In Asheville, the book was condemned by almost everyone, so much so that it was banned from the public library. He received a letter that threatened his life and others that were filled with hate and obscenities. Due to the negative reaction from his hometown, Wolfe would not return to Asheville for 7 years. Ironically, both the newspapers in Asheville, the Asheville Citizen and the Asheville Times, gave Look Homeward Angel positive reviews, and the book was well received virtually everywhere else. Margaret Wallace of the New York Times said that the book was as interesting and powerful a book as has ever been made out of the drab circumstances of provincial American life. The first printing was only 5,000 copies, but once the New York Times and the New York Herald Tribune gave it rave reviews, a second printing of 3,000 copies was ordered. 2,600 copies sold in the first 3 weeks of publication. The Great Depression that lasted from 1929 until 1939 certainly slowed the sale of the book, but Thomas Wolfe was well on his way to becoming a major American author. In Look Homeward Angel, Asheville is referred to as Altamont, and the boarding house his mother owned is called Dixieland. Also in the book, the Wolfe family is referred to as the Gant family. The Wolfe family were more understanding about their portrayal in the book than others in Asheville. But that's not to say there wasn't some tension. It has been said that Wolfe's mother, Julia, and sister Maybelle were troubled by parts of the book, and one of his brothers, Frank, was reportedly not pleased at all. Another brother, Fred, took it all in stride. Thomas Wolfe said that Look Homeward Angel is a book made out of my life, and so the book in many ways is the story of his life as seen through the eyes of Eugene Gant, his character in Look Homeward Angel. The revelations Wolfe discloses are formed from his family, his friends and acquaintances, and the places in and around Asheville, North Carolina. All in all, Look Homeward Angel was a success, Asheville notwithstanding, and this gave Thomas Wolfe and Maxwell Perkins much hope for the future. Because of the success of Look Homeward Angel, Wolfe was given a $4,500 advance for his next novel by Scribner's. This advance was arranged by Maxwell Perkins. Because of this advance and the royalties that would be coming from Look Homeward Angel, Wolfe resigned his teaching position on February the 6th, 1930. At the insistence of Maxwell Perkins, Wolfe applied for and received a Guggenheim Fellowship. This allowed him to go to Europe, which we know he loved, and work on his next novel. At this point in his life, Wolfe had grown tired of his relationship with Eileen Bernstein. He felt that she had become too controlling, and once he received his Guggenheim Fellowship, he made the decision to end their relationship. For her part, Miss Bernstein felt Wolfe had betrayed her. In her mind, she had stood by him and had supported him in every way. Nonetheless, when he arrived in Europe, he no longer communicated with her. This left Miss Bernstein confused and hurt. Wolfe left for Europe on May the 9th, 1930, and arrived in Paris on May the 19th. He traveled about Europe while writing and also met F. Scott Fitzgerald, whom he admired. He returned from Europe in February of 1931. He settled in Brooklyn, New York. He would change apartments several times. Of course, he continued writing, and one of his projects was titled The October Fair, which would later be retitled to Of Time in the River. He was also writing novellas and short stories during this time. Also, when Thomas returned from Europe, he discovered that Eileen Bernstein had suffered both a mental and physical breakdown, apparently due to their breakup. So much so that she had to be hospitalized. They apparently had some contact once Thomas returned from Europe. At some point in January of 1932, Julia, Thomas's mother, came to visit. It was during her visit that Eileen came by and an argument between Thomas and Eileen occurred. Julia involved herself into the dispute, which only escalated the circumstances. The situation ended with both Thomas and Julia physically removing Eileen from the apartment. The argument was apparently over money and other issues between Thomas and Eileen. In April of 1933, Wolfe had finished a good portion of Time in the River, and this resulted in him signing a contract to deliver the completed manuscript by August 1, 1933. He missed this deadline, but was able to hand over the remainder of the draft on December 14th of 1933. Of Time in the River continued the story of Eugene Gant from Look Homeward Angel. It was published on March the 8th, 1935. Thinking the book would be a failure, Wolfe had already left for another trip to Europe when it was published. Wolfe waited anxiously for news from Maxwell Perkins concerning reviews of the book. The first cable Wolfe received from Perkins told of very positive reviews and spoke of great praise about the book. Finally, after more positive reviews and comparisons of Wolfe to the great writers of the day, Perkins was able to convince Wolfe that indeed Of Time in the River was a success. Wolfe returned to New York City on July 4, 1935. By this time, the success of Time in the River was no longer in doubt. In this new book, the character of Esther Jack was based on Eileen Bernstein, and the story of Eugene Gant was intended to be a 6-book series. The character of Esther Jack in Of Time in the River was based on Eileen Bernstein. While Wolfe was in Europe, Eileen contacted Maxwell Perkins and told him if Wolfe had any ideas about having a character based on her in any forthcoming books, she would do whatever was necessary to prevent publication. Wolfe would abandon any further novels featuring Eugene Gant. Some would say that artistic evolution, personal growth, creative constraints, and publication challenges were valid reasons to move on from Eugene Gant. We will probably never know the real reason. Of Time in the River would become the third best-selling work of fiction in 1935. Unlike Look Homeward Angel, the town of Asheville embraced Of Time in the River, so much so that many of the people that were upset by their depiction in Look Homeward Angel were equally disappointed that they were left out of Time in the River. And unfortunately, Look Homeward Angel and Of Time in the River would be the only 2 novels written by Thomas Wolfe that would be published during his lifetime. On October 1st, 1935, Wolfe again moved into another apartment, this time in Manhattan. As always, he continued to write, and some of his work during this time would eventually become 2 other novels, those being The Web and the Rock and You Can't Go Home Again. In April of 1936, a literary critic, Bernard DeVato, in a review of Wolfe titled Genius is Not Enough, said Wolfe's writing was hacked and shaped and compressed into something resembling a novel by his editor, Maxwell Perkins, and the assembly line at Scribner's. DeVato also said, Mr. Wolfe has written some of the finest fiction of our day, but a great deal of what he writes is not fiction at all. It is only material with which he has struggled, but which has defeated him. As a parting shot, DeVato added, until Mr. Wolfe develops more craftsmanship, he will not be the important novelist he is now widely accepted as being. Because Bernard DeVato was a respected novelist, journalist, historian, and critic, his words stung Wolfe so much so that many believe this is what prompted him to end his relationship with Maxwell Perkins and Scribner's Publishing. Wolfe resented the implication that Maxwell Perkins and Scribner's were the reasons for his success. Also, he and Perkins were beginning to have disagreements that primarily centered around money issues, and Wolfe was going through some personal problems of his own that weighed heavily on his mind. To escape these mounting problems, Wolfe left for Germany on July 23, 1936, on what would be his last trip to Europe. By this time, Of Time in the River had been released in Germany and was a huge success. Wolfe went to Berlin and was able to take in some of the Olympic events being held there during the 1936 Games. He witnessed Jesse Owens win a gold medal for the United States. Owens would win 4 gold medals in Berlin. During his trip to Germany, Wolfe gained first-hand knowledge of how Hitler's Germany had changed the country since his last visit. Wolfe referred to Hitler as the Dark Messiah. Wolfe's experience seeing close up the brutality of the Nazi regime inspired him to write a novella titled I Have a Thing to Tell You. After it was published in 1937, his books were banned in Germany until Hitler lost power. Sometime around March of 1937, Wolfe came down with the flu and went to the doctor when the symptoms persisted. He told a friend that X-rays were taken of his lungs and they showed a tubercular scar on his right upper lobe. He refused further comment about this to his friend. After 7 years away, Thomas Wolfe, the prodigal son, returned to Asheville on May 3, 1937. He immediately went to the old Kentucky home that his mother still owned. It was a homecoming for Wolfe, and he spent his time with family and friends and walking around Asheville to visit all the places he knew so well from growing up there. During this trip, he stayed at the cabin of his friend, Max Whitson. The cabin is located in Otay, North Carolina, which is very close to Asheville. The seclusion of the cabin offered Wolfe a quiet and remote place to work. He did write some of what would eventually become a part of You Can't Go Home Again at the cabin. The cabin is still there today and is owned by the city of Asheville and is in need of repair. I have read that a full renovation is planned. In August of 1937, Wolfe had to go to Burnsville, North Carolina, to testify about a shooting he witnessed there. He was there for a few days and then returned to Asheville. Upon his return, it is reported that he got drunk to the point of being out of control, and it took 2 officers to arrest him. After he sobered up, he was released and no charges were filed. Wolfe would leave Asheville on September 2, 1937. He returned to New York City after making stops in Tennessee, Virginia, and Maryland. By the time he returned to New York, his divorce from Scribner's was well known. He would continue to try and find a publisher for the next few months and signed with Harper's on December 31, 1937. In 1938, Wolfe planned a trip to the western and northwestern parts of the United States. But before leaving, he left a manuscript with his new editor, Edward Aswell. The manuscript was over 4,000 typewritten pages, and the word count was over 1,200,000. The enormous manuscript would eventually be edited into 3 novels: The Web and the Rock, You Can't Go Home Again, and The Hills Beyond. But before heading west, Wolfe stopped at Purdue University, where he gave a speech at the annual Literary Awards banquet on May the 19th. Afterwards, he made stops in Chicago and Denver to meet up with some old friends. Wolfe made his way to Portland, Oregon on June the 8th of 1938. He was asked by Edward Miller, who worked for the Portland Oregonian, and Ray Conway, who was an executive with the Oregon State Motor Association, to join them on a 2-week tour by car of 11 national parks. The trip was conceived as a way to prove that Western national parks could be visited within a 2-week period. Wolfe accepted. They left on June the 20th from Portland, Oregon, and finished their journey on July the 2nd at Mount Rainier in Washington State. The entire trip was 4,632 miles. Conway and Miller did all of the driving because Wolfe had never learned how to drive. After a stop in Seattle, Washington, Wolfe took a short trip to British Columbia, Canada on July the 5th. While on the steamship he traveled on, he and a stranger shared a bottle of liquor, and Wolfe caught a respiratory infection due to sharing the bottle. This infection apparently triggered the tuberculosis that had been dormant in his right lung. He went back to Seattle to visit friends and attend a party in his honor on July the 9th. When he arrived at the party, his friends noticed how bad he looked, and he also had a severe cold. A few days after the party, he called one of his friends who had thrown the party for him, Teresa Stevens, and she convinced him to see a doctor, as he informed her he was feeling worse. She recommended her family doctor, E.C. Rouge. Dr. Rouge found that Wolfe had a temperature of 102, accompanied by hacking cough. His diagnosis was pneumonia. Wolfe needed to be hospitalized, but he did not like hospitals. Dr. Rouge recommended a sanitarium that he had established that was located about 12 miles outside of Seattle, called Furlong. Wolfe agreed with the doctor's recommendation. By the middle of June, Wolfe had gotten better. His temperature, which had gotten as high as 105, was now around 100. But his temperature continued to fluctuate, so Dr. Rouge sent him to Providence Hospital in Seattle the first week of August. X-rays were done, and they showed a consolidation of the upper lobe of the right lung. Soon, severe headaches and incoherence began. The doctors feared a brain tumor or abscess. By this time, Thomas's brother, Fred, had arrived at the hospital to be with his brother. Wolfe was under the care of Dr. Charles Watts at Providence. Fred Wolfe had dismissed Dr. Rouge. While in the hospital, Thomas Wolfe received a letter from his friend, Maxwell Perkins. Even though they were no longer working together and had many disagreements, they still valued each other's friendship. In what would be the last letter Wolfe would ever write, he penned an immediate reply to Perkins. Fred Wolfe had to go back home to his job, so on August 19th, Thomas's sister, Maybelle, came to sit with Thomas. His headaches had become worse, and the doctor started giving him Dilaudid to help him sleep. The doctors became more concerned about Wolfe and took more x-rays. After reviewing the x-rays, they concluded that Wolfe had either a tumor or abscess of the brain. He was sent to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland, where Dr. Walter Dandy, who was considered to be the best brain surgeon in the country at the time, was located. He arrived at Johns Hopkins on September 10, 1938, along with his mother Julia and sister Maybelle. Edward Aswell, his editor at Harper's, was also there. After examining Wolfe, Dr. Dandy told the family that Wolfe was in very bad shape. He wasn't sure if anything could be done for him. He explained that there was a tremendous amount of pressure in his head, so much so that it was causing his eyes to bulge. He told them that if it was cancer or multiple tuberculosis, there would be no hope. He did tell them if it was a tumor or abscess, then there may be a chance to save his life. They first did a draining procedure to relieve the pressure on his brain. The liquid that was released contained the markers of tuberculosis. The procedure did bring temporary relief of Wolfe's headaches. Dr. Dandy scheduled the surgery for September 12, 1938. He was hoping to find a single tubercle that could be removed, but when the skull was opened, the doctor found a multitude of tubercles over the right lobe of his cerebellum. Knowing there was no need to go further, Dr. Dandy did not operate. Dr. Dandy then told the family that there was no hope. He told them that Thomas has miliary tuberculosis of the brain. He gave him at the most 6 weeks to live. He also told them that he may die within the next few days of recovery, and if so, it would be much better for him. Wolfe did regain consciousness on September 13th and was able to talk with family members. But that did not last, as the following day he was once again in a state of unconsciousness. Thomas Clayton Wolfe passed away on Thursday morning, September 15th, 1938 at 5:30. His cause of death was listed as tuberculosis meningitis, with pulmonary tuberculosis contributing. Thomas Wolfe was 37 years old at the time of his death, just a few weeks shy of his 38th birthday. Wolfe's family and his body left Baltimore, Maryland on September 16th by train. On the morning of September 17th, the train arrived in Asheville, North Carolina. His body was placed in the sitting room of the old Kentucky home. Many friends, acquaintances, and colleagues came by that day to pay their respects and speak to the family. Thomas Wolfe's funeral was held at First Presbyterian Church in Asheville on Sunday, September 18, 1938. The service began at 3 p.m. Not surprisingly, the church was packed, and many attendees had to stay outside of the church during the service because there was no room for them in the church. After the funeral, Thomas Clayton Wolfe was laid to rest at the Riverside Cemetery in Asheville, North Carolina. For the last few minutes of this video, I would like to talk about the legacy of Thomas Wolfe and his works that were published after his passing. And as I do so, I will show some of the images that I took of the old Kentucky home and the Thomas Wolfe Museum on a recent trip to Asheville, North Carolina. I would also like to say that during my senior year in college, which was many years ago, I read Look Homeward Angel. And after graduating, I also read Of Time in the River and You Can't Go Home Again. And I am presently reading Look Homeward Angel again. Before his death, Thomas Wolfe was considered to be in the company of William Faulkner, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Ernest Hemingway by many critics of the day. Look Homeward Angel set a standard that made it extremely difficult for Wolfe to duplicate. His second novel, Of Time in the River, was a huge success, and his standing as a great American novelist was secured. So much so that William Faulkner said that Wolfe was the most important American writer of the 1920s and the 1930s. After Wolfe's death, his editor at Harper's, Edward Aswell, was tasked with editing the unfinished work that Wolfe had given him back in May of 1937. This required a lot of work, but eventually resulted in 2 novels, The Web and the Rock, published in 1939, and You Can't Go Home Again, published in 1940. Also, from the same material, Wolfe left with Asheville a collection of short stories titled The Hills Beyond was published in 1941. Wolfe was a pioneer for his innovative style that pushed the boundaries of conventional writing of his time, and for his ability to focus on the personal and emotional experiences of himself and others. Wolfe also had a unique ability to give the reader graphic mental images, as well as separate and define individual human experiences through his works. His influence on American literature, in my opinion, cannot be denied. He influenced a list of writers such as Norman Mailer, Gore Vidal, Harlan Ellison, John Steinbeck, James Baldwin, and Pat Conroy, and others. Wolfe's writing style has affected a wide scope of American writers. But his critics often pointed to what they called his excessive style. Some said it was overly elaborate or self-indulgent. There were others who thought he was unnecessarily wordy with parts of his writings, and some took issue with the structure he used when writing his novels. They argued that many of his passages were too lengthy and detracted from the overall consistency and pacing of his stories. After his death in September of 1938, Wolfe's writings continued to be debated. Over time, his works have undergone many re-evaluations. The initial questions concerning his style and structure seem to have given way to a greater appreciation for his literary contributions. His works are valued not only for their innovative approach to writing, but also the strong emotions they invoke. He is, in my opinion, a literary giant who often gets overlooked in discussions about the great writers and their place in history. I think today his novels are seen as an important forerunner to the style of writing that others would adopt because of his influence. He wrote with passion and gave us insight to the human condition as he saw it. His writing style helped push the evolution of creative storytelling to levels not seen before. For me, his writings are so vivid, it offers an opportunity to visualize the events as I read. He writes with emotion, precise imagery, and symbolism. Personally, I favor that style of writing. It keeps me interested and focused, and to me, that's what a writer should do. I know there are those who are critical of Thomas Wolfe's novels for a variety of reasons. I am not a literary scholar or a literary critic. I am just someone who enjoys his style of writing, and that style allowed his characters and their stories to resonate with me. I really hope you enjoyed this video on the life of Thomas Wolfe. When I started, I did not plan on it being this long. But once I started researching his life, I decided to tell his story as best I could. Please hit the subscribe and like buttons and share this video with family and friends. I will have another video out soon, and until then, I wish you all the best. And thanks again for watching.